Well, it's the top of the hour, so I should really start the ramble. So thank you very much for joining us today. As I said, I'm Jeff Richards. This is the first of the Churchyard Rambles, and I'm one of the trustees of the Friends of St. Nicholas Churchyard. Now, I started these online Sunday sessions to get over some of the boredom that is a consequence of not being able to meet up in person. We are living through a historic time, so we may as well take some time for history. I intend these sessions to be short. I don't think anyone could stand my voice for more than 15 minutes, but in this time together I'm going to take you on a churchyard ramble to try and explore a lesser known aspect of Sutton's history. So, what's our topic for today? Well, nobody actually suggested anything to me, so I decided to pick a topic that interested me, and I picked the first named priest of Sutton. It's probably not the most exciting of topics, but it is actually something that we can start to really explore. The first named priest of Sutton was called Nicholas de Heddeshore, and he became priest of the parish on the 23rd of October 1291. But in that it raises quite a lot of questions, like what was Sutton like in 1291? Who lived in Sutton? What was his church like? And remember, this ramble is brought to you by the Friends of St. Nicholas Churchyard, so there is a heavy bias towards God's Acre. And is this anything to do with the church being named St. Nicholas? Well, let's see. Sutton enters the history books in AD 675, and that's when it was recorded as being the property of Chertsey Abbey. And I wish we could claim a dramatic founding myth, but actually in the year of our Lord 675, Sutton was just a farm estate that was gifted by a Saxon king to the Abbot of Chertsey, and our entry into history is simply an entry in an asset register. Not the most exciting of ways of entering history. But Sutton has its own interests. It's an interesting shape. For example, if you look at the map of Sutton, a medieval map of Sutton, you will see that it is long and thin, as were the neighbouring manors of Carshalton and Beddington and Cuddington as well. So the old parish and manor was approximately 3 miles long. That's running from north to south, and it was about a mile wide east to west, and comprised of around about, well, just shy of 1,800 acres of land. To the north were tracks that connected Sutton to Staines Street, and Staines Street is the A24 to you and me, so that's the Rose Hill and London Road bit at the end of, so it's all at the Rose Hill end of Sutton. At the south, the manor and parish rise onto the northern slope of the Downs. Now, we call it Staines Street as the name given to the, it's about 56 miles long, it's 90 kilometres odd long, the Roman road that linked London to Chichester. Well, actually, when the Romans built it, they thought they were linking it from Londinium to Novius Magnus, Novius Magus Reginorum. So there you go, which actually the Saxons then renamed Chichester. And we know it, we know that the road was called Stanstret by 1291, when our story kicks in. We know that because there are some other Chertsey registers and things like that which give that sense of what the name is. So the bit of Stanstret near Sutton is the only section of the road that is actually on the true line from London Bridge to the east gate of Chichester. And the fact that the road passes through Sutton Common and forms the northern boundary of Sutton may give Sutton its name. So the name Sutton comes from the Old English Suth Tun, meaning south enclosure. So it may be the enclosure just south of the road. And the enclosure, if it was that, could have been what was Oldfields Farm, which in turn became Rose Hill. And nearly all of the houses in the parish were north of what is now the Cheam and Carlshorton roads, because there were no sources of fresh water. And so in the south of the parish, there were mostly extensive chalk downs, and they were really only any good for grazing. But sometime after 1291, that would become fantastically important for sheep, and that really does have to be another story. But the fact that we are called Sutton, the southern enclosure, begs the question: was there a northern? Was there a western? Was there an eastern enclosure? Where is Norton? Where is Western? Where is Eastern? We need to know. This is something that burns with curiosity. Well, perhaps it does. But anyway, I'm trying to tell you that this is a story about Nicholas, the first named priest of Sutton. So he lived in 1291, or he became priest in 1291. So what am I lingering on about how Sutton came to be, which was 600 years before he showed up? Well, that's really part of the point. For the next 600 years, Sutton was little more than a big field with shacks and a few peasants wandering around. We do get Sutton showing up in 1086 as part of the Domesday Book, when that was drawn up. And Domesday Book is a great survey of England compiled by monks for William I of England, or William the Conqueror. But since he was actually had the book compiled, because he was very interested in tax revenue, we can also call him William the Bastard. And so that's the manor of Sutton at that time, and that still belonged to the Abbot of Chertsey. The Abbot of Chertsey had basically owns Sutton for the best part of 900 years, up until the 16th century. And in the Domesday Book, the entry for Sutton, once translated from the odd ecclesiastical Latin, reads: "The abbey holds Sutton itself. Before 1066, it answered for 30 hides, now for 8.5 hides. Land for 15 ploughs. In lordship 2 ploughs, 21 villagers, 4 cottages with 13 ploughs, 2 churches, 2 slaves, meadow, 2 acres, woodland at 10 pigs, values before 1066, £20, now £15. Now, many of the people who have written about Sutton in the past, it's the mention of 2 churches that's the main point of interest. But for me, it's the startling evidence between 1066 and 1086 of the destruction of English culture and society that had taken place in those 20 years. So the Norman conquest had been devastating to Sutton, and the productivity of the holding of Sutton had collapsed by a quarter of its pre-invasion value. And since the value was really based on the annual revenues of the manor, which needed manpower for agriculture, and the number of hides, for example, they talk about, is to do with the amount of land that is under cultivation. It's a measure of the land. It shows that the village may have suffered partial depopulation, probably because it lost a lot of adult men as the Normans conquered the land. But if I just think about the structure of the remaining villages back in 1086, the remaining inhabitants of Sutton were a mixed society of villeins, cottars and slaves. Those are 27 people, and they would have been the heads of households, and so that may have meant a population of no more than 150 souls. All of the people mentioned there, the entire village of Sutton, were unfree and in a state of either serfdom or outright chattel slavery. And so the people described as villagers, villeins, or cottagers, cottars, were in a state of serfdom. They were tied to the abbot and the convent of Chertsey and owed him a lifetime's obligation of labour. Now, in return, they had rights to work a portion of the land in the open fields for themselves. the villagers and the cotters, while not free, were not absolute slaves. The title villagers and villeins simply means that they were inhabitants of a ville, and they did have rights to certain bits. They did have rights. Cottagers had less rights, but it certainly, land meant the opportunity to earn money, because the more land, the more crops, the more wealth. It was these villeins and cottars whose labour kept the abbot's bit of the land running. So that was 2 ploughs. That's his demesne, or if you look at it written down, it says demesne, but it's demesne. And they were the ones who kept his farm prosperous and in business. And it was the demesne farms that gave the abbot and convent at Chertsey their main income from Sutton, until about 5 generations after Nicholas de Heddeshore, it really became sheep became the most important thing. But even by the time that Nicholas became the priest in Sutton, absolute chattel slavery had died out. So, but the thing that did remain was this concept of serfdom. So they were his congregation was made up of villeins and cottars who had varying degrees of rights. So what about his church? Domesday mentions that Sutton may have had 2 churches. So the second church may actually have been in Hawley. There is some. I've had conversations with people who may have actually thought it was a side chapel or a separate building within the same land. But Chertsey Abbey certainly had one-time properties over in Hawley, and that was administered through Sutton Manor. So the building that we have now is certainly not the building that Nicholas de Heddeshore would have known. The current building was built in 1864, and that building, the whole question of the building is definitely a subject for another session. Even before that building, so when the Victorians knocked down the medieval church, that medieval church had been built a generation after Nicholas. It was built by a guy called Rotherwick, who was the abbot of Chertsey, a little time after Nicholas de Heddeshore's period. So it's likely that Nicholas's church was a small wooden building, originally built in Saxon times. There is only one tantalising trace of the medieval church, and that's inside the building, because in the 1920s, a medieval piscina, which is a vessel or a basin for washing the vessels used in the Mass, was discovered in the churchyard and placed in the South Lady Chapel. So that's there in the church. If we think about the congregation, there wouldn't have been pews in the church. There may have been some benches to put against the walls. The service would all have been in Latin, completely unintelligible for most of the people. But preaching had started to come into fashion because of the activities of the Franciscans and Dominicans in the 13th century. So a parish priest like Nicholas de Heddeshore, living at the end of the 13th century, may often have provided his congregation with a homily or a sermon in English. So you can imagine that he was getting used to talking to people. So it was the new wave of being trained. Now the congregation mostly passive, because the priest was the one who was looking after the conversation with God. So he had his back to the congregation for most of the service. The congregation would only know what was going on because there was a little bell that would be rung by his servitor, his servant, during that. And they'd only have to receive communion once a year. And that was that had been a papal decree in 1215 made yearly communion mandatory, but it was expected that was to be more honoured in the breach than in the observance, because in a community like Sutton, the need to take advantage of fine weather always trumped any thing that the church might say. So there was always going to be some services skipped if the harvest had to be got in or the planting had to be done or something. So why do we have a church called St. Nicholas? And we are fantastically lucky in Sutton having a church that has had such a long existence. So we have a church in Sutton that goes way back before the Norman conquest. And that means that the congregation of St. Nicholas is over 1,000 years old. Not all of the congregation, just some of them. So St. Nicholas was a real person. He had been a bishop in Myra, in what is now Turkey, but that was way back in 340 AD, in the 340s, and that was when it was a Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. I could do a whole session on St. Nicholas. I'm not going to do that now, but St. Nicholas had, in 1087, some of his bones were moved from Myra to Bari in Apulia in the south of Italy. And that's why sometimes he's known as Nicolaus of Bari. And the remaining bones were taken to Venice in 1100. So it's clear that the Saxon church wasn't called St. Nicholas. We don't know what it was called. It probably got its name actually after Nicholas de Heddeshore's name. He was, obviously it's a name that had started to become popular. Bari was and is a port city, and in the 12th century and later, it became an important departure point for crusaders and merchants alike, as well as a destination itself for pilgrims. And so the stories of St. Nicholas would have come to England as the merchants, pilgrims, and crusaders returned home. And all churches in the medieval period had to be, if they were dedicated to a saint, must have had a relic of that saint. And one of the odd stories of St. Nicholas is that his bones give off a sweet smell and weep a mysterious liquid which could cure those who touched it. And Nicholas is a fantastically popular name for churches in England. So there's over 500 parish churches in England named after Nicholas. And so St. Sutton's church was dedicated to St. Nicholas. There would have been a relic placed in the altar, and perhaps it was a cloth that had been soaked in the liquid, brought back by a pilgrim or a knight, and brought back to Sutton. And I would imagine that it was in the time of, it was the generation after Nicholas de Heddeshore that the church actually, when it was rebuilt by John de Rotherwick, the abbot of Chertsey, that they renamed it to Nicholas. Now, I think I've come to the end of my ramble. I do hope you have enjoyed listening to those stories. Do comment on what you may want me to talk about again on the next Churchyard Rambles, and give me some suggestions as to how I can improve the talks. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much, Sutton. Your history.